Ken Burns' latest documentary is a detailed and fascinating exploration into the complex social and political events that led up to the passage of the 18th Amendment in the 1920s. Prohibition, which set off an era of unprecedented organized crime and widespread hypocrisy, offers an historical example of a failed, nearsighted policy laden with unintended consequences. The amendment's eventual repeal provides a sliver of hope that the United States' current policy towards the global drug war can also change direction. The parallels between the present-day war on drugs and the temperance movement's push for alcohol prohibition a century ago are plentiful.
America needs a tidal wave of the old-time religion. America needs to be taken down to God's bathhouse and the hose turned on her. And the time isn't far distant when the wheels of God's judgment are going to go sweeping through this old God-hating world. And I want to take a pledge in this audience to join me in a pledge that you will never rest until this old God-hating, Christ-hating, whiskey-soaked, Sabbath-breaking, blaspheming, infidel, bootlegging old world is bound to the cross of Jesus Christ by the golden chains of love.
Both policies sought to address a social evil and acted to curb its dangerous effects through legislative measures of restriction. In both cases, the results of these control measures disproportionately affected minorities and lower-class citizens. In both cases, astronomical proportions of the federal budget were allocated to increase law enforcement capability from the local to the national level, which included everything from interdiction, eradication, search and seizure, criminal punishment, and intelligence. In both cases, the government and its supporters maintained a doctrine of infallibility despite the campaign's growing futility. But any one of us can go out today and legally buy a pint after today's class, provided we're 21. Get in the car after a few more, however, and well, now you've broken the law. The controls of social behavior operate on a spectrum. Some Latin American leaders have recently called on the region, and more specifically the United States, to explore the vast middle ground that exists between the two polar extremes of outright prohibition and wholesale legalization.
Market alternatives, market solutions. The point is the astronomical rentals that the criminals have coming from the consumption in the United States must to be addressed. And my point is either we reduce consumption or we need more alternatives, more solutions to at least to analyze, and among them, of course, we need to include the market alternative.
And yet, despite the calls for a rational debate on alternative approaches to drug policy, the Obama administration has maintained a posture of childish obstinacy. It behaves as though it is immune from public critique and empirical evidence, and it has refused to engage regional leaders in any semblance of thoughtful dialogue. Why? Is it a fear of admitting that this country's drug policy has been an abject failure? Or perhaps it is reluctant to confess this categorical misread of domestic and foreign drug policy to its own backyard. Either way, a glance at the numbers reveals it is a rather difficult square to circle. And yet, we carry on. But before we get to the numbers, we should consider the stakes at play. In 1968, Richard Nixon ran a successful campaign centered on reestablishing law and order. By 1971, he had narrowed his homeland target on a pervasive evil poisoning the streets.
From New York State, I realize the need for money to deal with this problem. I am glad that in this administration we have increased the amount of money for handling the problem of dangerous drugs sevenfold. It will be $600 million this year. More money will be needed in the future. I want to say, however, that despite our budget problems, to the extent money can help in meeting the problem of dangerous drugs, it will be available. This is one area where we cannot have budget cuts because we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
His administration unleashed a full frontal attack on dealers big and small, users young and old, and thus the phrase, war on drugs, was permanently etched into the nation's collective vocabulary. Political currency is priceless. Political suicide, unthinkable. Herein lies the false dichotomy at work in today's war on drugs. That there exists only two options: either outright prohibition or uncontrolled free market legalization. From that premise, it is rather obvious to conclude which route to take. After all, drugs are bad, so we should wage war on drugs, right? Politicians get to look tough in front of voters.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children. From the beginning of our administration,
The drug bureaucracy is delighted with ever-expanding budgets. We lock up petty offenders and clean up the streets. To put it plainly, the war on drugs fails even on its own terms. So what are its terms, and how exactly does the government implement a strategy toward achieving their stated goals? The goal, albeit lofty and perhaps unrealistic, is to eliminate domestic drug abuse through the eradication of the narcotics supply coming from the coca-growing regions of the Andes, the marijuana fields of Mexico, the opium fields of Afghanistan, and any site that assists in their trafficking along the way. For the drugs that manage to infiltrate the borders and fall into the hands of users, we search them, arrest them, convict them, incarcerate them, and demand that they never do it again, lest they want to repeat the process. How effective are these tactics in achieving the stated goals? San Ho Tree, a fellow for the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and the director of the Drug Policy Project, which works to end the domestic and international war on drugs, recently wrote an op-ed for Alternet.org in which he shared this encouraging fact. When the United States ramped up its anti-drug efforts through Plan Colombia, more than 90% of the cocaine consumed in the United States came through Colombia. Over a decade later, we get 97% of our cocaine via Colombia. When ex-President Felipe Calderón launched his ill-conceived, all-out drug war in late 2006 with the strong endorsement and financial aid of the United States, the Army took the lead because the police forces were deemed too corrupt. 6 short years has resulted in the deaths of over 70,000 Mexican citizens. And yes, while some of the dead were cartel leaders, the majority were innocent victims. In recent years, Honduras has descended into horrific violence stemming in large part from organized crime. In response, the U.S. Defense Department spent over $67 million on military contracts in Honduras in order to combat transnational narcotics trafficking. And while tens of thousands perish in its wake, the United States government applauds every interdiction of marijuana, every captured drug lord, every hectare of coca crop destroyed. The numbers at home are no less self-defeating. In the 30 years since Ronald Reagan escalated the war on drugs, the U.S. prison population has exploded from around 300,000 to more than 2 million, nonviolent drug convictions being the significant cause for the 6-fold increase. It must be pointed out that this expansion in criminal convictions does not reflect a growing epidemic in drug use. In fact, drug use and the violent crime often associated with it are at historic lows. Between 1981 and 1984, the FBI's anti-drug funding increased from 8 million to 95 million. The DEA's anti-drug funding from 86 million to 1,026 million. In contrast, federal funding for drug treatment, prevention, and education was slashed from 274 million to 57 million. Federal grant initiatives like the Byrne program dangled huge sums of money in front of local and state law enforcement agencies on the one condition that they assist in the escalation and implementation of the war on drugs. Now armed with military weaponry and sophisticated intelligence provided by the Pentagon, thousands of precincts around the country created drug enforcement agencies and SWAT teams of their own to combat the pernicious effects of drugs. Legislators and law enforcement officials have opted for a punitive, supply-side approach and has all but ignored avenues of prevention and treatment. After all, the drug trade is driven by the market, with annual profits upwards of $85 billion. The United States comprises 5% of the global population and consumes more than 2/3 of illicit substances. Clearly, there is no lack of demand. Drug criminals are fighting over the right to traffic what are essentially minimally processed agricultural commodities that should, in essence, cost pennies per dose. Prohibition gives these substances an unintended, astronomical price support. Our metrics of success are warped and laced with unintended consequences. The prevailing myth of the drug war is that keeping drugs illegal will protect us. But drug prohibition doesn't mean that we control drugs. It means we give up the right to control them because we can't regulate an industry we drive underground. How do we promote an honest debate about drug policy in the United States? There are willing and able players all over the region waiting for the United States, the main consumer and principal financier of the drug war, to start listening. As it stands, the United States government is stuck in a Chinese finger trap with regards to the drug war. Intuitively, they keep pulling and pulling and pulling, fumigating and interdicting, arresting and convicting. Mark Twain, a famous repeat offender of spot-on insight and social satire, once commented, "Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. Fanatics will never learn that, though it be written in letters of gold across the sky." It is the prohibition that makes anything precious. If it is true that this country was founded on the idea that personal liberty should be expanded, not contracted, then it is about time that this country act to restore the public trust in its public officials. If it is true that this country is one of freedom and ideals, then it is time that this country acts to breach the divide between stated ideals and flawed action. Without such efforts, the United States cannot and should not expect the admiration or respect of its citizenry or the world at large, a position of authority it has come to believe is its God-given right. A broken nation intent on projecting itself outward without addressing its own wounds will only assist in the poisoning of the very nations for which it claims to be fighting. And we believe a genuine reevaluation of the war on drugs would be a fine place to start the internal healing process.